Good evening. I'm Mike Neary, Extension Sheep and Goat Specialist here at Purdue University. I want to thank you for joining us for the 2020 webinar. This is the 10th year for this webinar, and we are pleased to still be continuing our cooperation with Kentucky State University in the sponsorship of it and the input of some of the counties in Kentucky. Just a couple of things before we get started. I want to take a minute or two to recognize the planning committee for this webinar. That would include Dr. Ken Andrews, the goat specialist from Kentucky State, Mark Kepler, county extension educator from Indiana, Sarah Zamansky, county extension educator from Indiana, Alicia Rogers, county extension educator from Indiana. And I want to give special acknowledgement to Phil Reed, our distance education specialist, and Dr. Scott Radcliffe, who's a professor of animal science, for the technical know-how. I can assure you this webinar would not be possible without those two gentlemen's help. We have a theme for this year, for this year's webinar, centered around the topic of how a poor hay year can affect. We seem to have a lot of interest in this year's webinar, primarily I think because this is a real problem this year and actually was a problem last year, and it's widespread in nature. We have two talks on this subject. One describes the nature of the problem. The other talk some solutions. We have two excellent speakers, Dr. Keith Johnson, forage crop specialist at Purdue University, and Dr. Richard Earhart, sheep and goat specialist from Michigan State University. Please feel free to submit questions. We do encourage questions. Please submit them as soon as you think of them, so the odds are increased they will get answered in a timely manner. We will answer questions at the end of each presentation, and they will be sorted by themes or topics. The other thing is please take our survey for the program. We really look at the surveys closely to get your feedback on what you enjoyed, what could have been better, and especially we look at potential topics for future webinars. We have had topics from webinars based upon the responses from the viewers. With no further ado, we're going to get started. The first speaker is Dr. Keith Johnson, Purdue Forage Crop Specialist. Dr. Johnson will cover the talk entitled Forage Quality Matters for Sheep and Goats. We thank you for participating, and we thank you, Dr. Johnson, for coming.
Well, thank you, Dr. Neary. I appreciate the introduction, and it's a pleasure to welcome shepherds and herders and educators and those in the allied industries of sheep and goat production to be part of this program. And we are going to discuss forage quality matters for sheep and goats tonight. The objectives of this evening's presentation is to define forage quality, learn what affects forage quality and why it's so dynamic from one time in the year to other years, and learn how to determine forage quality, which is a sensory analysis or a chemical analysis. So we're going to also look at defining several items that are found in a forage analysis report form. I think it's important to have this background because as you receive reports back, you're going to have some alphabet information there that without a little bit of background you won't have an understanding to be able to have conversation with a nutritionist about what some of the meaning of those numbers and letters represent. And then really the end result is to really encourage you to sample your forage and get it tested and allocate it based on the quality of the forage that you receive, and then to balance rations. And again, the second presentation tonight will deal with the improving of the forage quality that we might have with some supplementation if called upon. So let's start with just what forage quality is all about. It's an expression of the things that affect the consumption and the nutritive value and how these animals perform and their health. What this requires to have an understanding of is the physical characteristics of the forage, and this is where we do the sensory analysis. And it became apparent to me as we go about doing this that we used to call this visual appraisal, but frankly it's more than that. It utilizes senses other than eyes to really do a good job of looking at the physical characteristics of the forage. And then it also allows us then to see things and feel things and smell things that aren't necessarily going to be told by a chemical analysis without doing that. Then we look at the chemical characteristics, and with that we're doing a laboratory analysis which does provide us some numbers, which then we can pass them on to a nutritionist to help us develop rations to keep those animals performing as we really want them to perform. So in terms of understanding forage quality, I'd like to tell you a story, a true story that happened in my career. And this dealt with a shepherd that gave me a call, and he said, "Keith, I have outstanding alfalfa hay quality here, and my ewes are not readily eating this hay at all. What's the matter?" So I asked the shepherd to send me representative flakes of this hay, and he did, followed up very quickly. And a nice box arrived, and I opened it up, and I put my hand into that box, and I immediately withdrew it because there was a trace of Canada thistle in this box in terms of with the hay. And so, of course, if you know anything about thistle, you know that they have some spines on it. And so, you know, it hurt my hand, so I wondered, gosh, what about those sheep trying to consume this hay? So I called the shepherd back and I said, "I'd really like you to go take a look at the mouths of these ewes and see what's going on to see if there's a problem with their refusal of this because of the trace of Canada thistle that's in it." And sure enough, he went out and he called me back and said, yes, there definitely is some blistering and some hurt mouths in this. And this then went on to tell me about a problem associated with chemical analysis by itself without sensory analysis, because I was aware of a study that was done with the USDA Ag Research Station in Minnesota, and they were looking at the nutritive value of different types of weeds, and one of these weeds happened to be Canada thistle. And I recalled, and I went back and revisited the publication, and sure enough, if you had a bale of Canada thistle by itself and a bale of alfalfa hay, and you analyze them, you're going to find that the nutritional quality is very, very similar. And so that tells me, you know, we're not going to be able to see these differences chemically. We definitely need to be doing a sensory analysis. So complementary are sensory and chemical evaluation. I think we really need to do both as we look at hay quality. So what are some of the things that affect forage quality from cutting to cutting and season to season? Well, one of these is maturity at the stage of harvest. And this was a big, big problem in 2019, because what we were doing is a lot of us didn't get first cutting accomplished until late June or very early July, as compared to trying to get this done in a timely fashion in May and late May. So huge concern in 2019. The other thing that affects quality is the species, and typically legumes like red clover shown in the picture or alfalfa are going to be of higher quality than our cool season grasses grown singly or even in combination with them. So species affects forage quality. The other thing is that we actually can have variety within a species that has an effect. So if we take a look here on the screen, we have a picture here of the brown midrib of a sorghum plant. And this is a phenotype which tells us by vision that this particular plant has a lesser amount of lignin that makes it more desirable in terms of consumption and animal performance. So the other thing is, as we take a look at tall fescues as differences of varieties within a species, is that we know that the old variety Kentucky 31 has a endophytic within plant fungus that produces alkaloids that can cause a host of different types of animal performance problems. And plant breeders developed low endophyte varieties, and now we have novel endophyte varieties that have an endophytic fungus, but it doesn't produce the alkaloid. So the response to the same species of grass through different varieties can differ quite a bit. The other thing is, how leafy is the forage? We'd like to have a high amount of leaf retention, and so we have examples here in picture. You can take a look here on the one here on the left. Not much leaf matter is being found on these stems, so this particular forage is probably going to be testing lower in quality as compared to one that has excellent leaf retention. The other thing is pests. So we look at different types of pests, and when I describe pests, I'm thinking more than just insect pests. I'm thinking about diseases, and again, some weeds are going to be very low in nutritive value, and the possibility as well that there could be some toxic type of principles happening, and so that can be an anti-quality factor as well. And I don't know if you read in the news about 10 days ago or not, but the picture that I have there is a blister beetle, and it caused extreme problems in the horse industry up in Wisconsin. Somebody that stabled horses, and many of them, purchased some hay out of state that had blister beetle within it, and it definitely caused some major problems in that particular operation. So the other thing is the environment. So how much moisture, how much rain occurs. If we think about a cut crop and we have rain fall upon a cut crop, we're leaching soluble sugars into the soil. Some of the minerals are also going to leach out and aren't going to be within the hay, so that lowers quality. But also temperature and sunlight also are things in a physiological sense that improves or causes problems associated with quality in any particular cutting. And then we can think about mold. So if we look at harvesting a crop and we get in a rush of making it and we make it at too high of a moisture content, what can happen? Well, we can get mold formation, and that's going to reduce the quality of the forage. Presence of foreign matter. So it may not be as extreme as broken glass, but we can have examples there of dead animals. We might have things associated with cans and those sorts of things. So any sort of presence of foreign matter that is found in the hay can have some effect on the quality and the consumption, of course, of that particular hay. And the other thing in terms of fermentation of silage, whether it be the individual wrap bales like this or those in a tube, or whether we're talking about the traditional chop form of silage, we really would like to have pH take us with the production of lactic acid, drive that pH down to something less than 4.5 to really have excellent quality forage as formed as silage. Also the storage conditions that we have. So if we're not protecting high quality hay and it sets outside, not setting on some sort of surface that reduces the wicking of water up into the bottom of the bale, this obviously is also going to affect the quality, and you'll have decomposition of that hay that you worked so hard to put in the bale actually deteriorate over time. So sensory analysis, it does definitely include the vision, the touch, and the smell. It's more than visual appraisal. So let's move on to the chemical analysis now of forage quality. And it's very critical that a representative sample be taken so that when we do send it off to the laboratory, it truly does represent the quality of the hay that we probed of the sample that we took to the laboratory. So we want to use a hay probe. We don't want to just go in and grab a handful or handfuls of hay, because as you do that, you're going to be losing some of the quality in terms of leaf matter that's not going to end up in the sample. So it's very critical to utilize a hay probe that allows to take representative samples. So probes are used with battery or electric drills. They can also be done with a brace, or there are probes that can be done with manual force. And I would encourage you to take time to go to this particular website, www.foragetesting.org, and this is really an excellent website that will tell us where hay probes can be purchased. the type of probe that they are. There'll be a listing of certified laboratories that are there as well, and just good information that'll be a reminder on how to take a representative sample. So how do you collect that representative sample? Well, you want to randomly select hay bales from the same harvest within a field, and this is what we call a lot, L-O-T, lot. And we want to probe 2 cores from each of 10 large bales. And we want to probe 1 core from each of 20 small rectangular bales and probe the side curvature of these round bales. And then we probe the butt end of the rectangular bales. So 20 probings in total will be what your sample represents. Again, 2 cores from each of 10 large bales, or a core each from small rectangular bales of 20 in number to give us these 20 probings. And so a picture then of what we mean by the curvature of a large round bale, and then taking a look at what I mean by the butt end of a large rectangular or small rectangular bale. So then what we do is we want to use a plastic bag. Ziploc works fantastic. We don't want to place these in a paper bag because as they're shipped to the laboratory, we're going to find that they're going to lose moisture, and it's very, very important when we think about feeding the forage on an as-is basis rather than on a dry matter basis. We want to make sure that we have a real representation of what moisture is in that particular sample that we collected. Label the bag so it makes sense to you from where this came from, and then mail or take it directly to a certified lab. And again, the website foragetesting.org will tell you what certified labs are in the states of which you reside. And I think that's important to use them. Essentially, what happens is the laboratories are sent samples that they run through their chemical analyses or their spectrophotometer to give us an idea of the quality, and essentially they're given a grade. So if they do not receive a passing grade, they don't have the certification standards. So that's what the certification is about. So what tests should be requested? Well, a basic test is probably enough to start with. We don't need the full load, but just a basic test, and I'll describe what I consider that to be in a minute. And the techniques that we can use is we can use benchtop wet lab type of chemistry, or back in the 1980s there was really a lot of research that was done using a near-infrared reflectance spectrophotometer, and this is definitely an acceptable means of looking at quality. And what an NIRS, the near-infrared reflectance spectrophotometer, is all about is it measures differences in the reflectance of organic molecules in response to the absorption of energy by hydrogen bonds with carbon and nitrogen and oxygen in the near-infrared range. And then the calibrate equations developed from the spectra and the laboratory analytical data. So they actually use wet lab chemistry to help derive the equations that then with the spectra from the NIR predict what the quality is. And so it accurately predicts crude protein, fiber values, and digestibility. And we want to say that organic compounds, like I mentioned, are definitely predicted better than the minerals by use of NIRS. And what's the value of NIRS? Well, it's a quick turnaround time, and the cost is going to typically be less than what would be in wet lab chemistry use. So pictures here, and essentially the last one that I showed was loading a sample in that little cuvette there that'll be loaded into the spectrophotometer, and will then create spectra that develop equations that tell us what the quality is all about. So what I would suggest should be requested on the analysis form is dry matter, crude protein, adjusted crude protein, and then a couple of fiber traits, neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. And then if you have a silage sample, okay, or of course that would be the fermented hay that we call baleage as well, I would request a pH to give an indication as to whether we did reach that target pH of 4.5 or not. The cost per sample does range depending upon what the request is, and it's going to depend on the analytical method and the test actually requested, but it's going to be in the range of $15 to $38 per sample. So really want you to focus just a minute here in terms of some definitions, because I think there'll be some terms that Dr. Earhart from Michigan State will probably talk about that really relates to developing rations. And so these are some terms that I think we need to review. And for some of you, this probably is a review. For some of you, it may be a first time. But stick with me now for a few minutes as we take you through some of these basic terminologies. The first one is moisture percent, and of course that's the percent of the sample that is water. And typically our hay, when it equilibrates, is going to be around 12 to 13%. If you get an analysis back and its moisture is up in the 20% range, probably you're going to find that there's going to be some mold formation that occurred, and so it's not a good thing. So it's an indication that probably we have the forage made more right than not. And then of course what dry matter is 100 minus the moisture percent, the percentage of the sample that is not water. And again, we need to do that and have that so we can know what to actually feed as is. When we take that hay to the animal, we need to inflate the amount actually taken, because again, it's not 100% dry matter. We do have some moisture in that sample. Particularly important when we think about differences in moisture in silage products. So protein is actually, when it goes into the laboratory, is measured as percent nitrogen, and it's taken times a factor of 6 1/4 to give us crude protein. It's a mixture of true protein and non-protein nitrogen. And one of the reasons that we want to think about the adjusted crude protein value and a request that that be made is that unfortunately you're going to find, particularly when hay may have been made a little bit too moist, that there can be a binding of the protein to carbohydrates, and as a result, because of that binding, we find that there may be some protein that's not available to the animal because of the binding that occurs as we make hay maybe a little bit too moist. And so the rule of thumb that typically you find laboratories use is that there will be an adjustment occur in terms of the adjusted crude protein if the protein that's been heat damaged is greater than 10 relative percent of protein value. So let me give you an example. If we were to have a crude protein value that came across as 12%, and if we were to find that the heat-bound or the insoluble crude protein was 1.3%, that's greater than 12%. 1.3 is greater than 1.2. 1.2 is 10% of 12. They would adjust the crude protein. So when you balance rations, you really want to look for the adjusted crude protein and not just the crude protein value to make sure that we're taking into the protein availability as the sheep and goats consume it. Neutral detergent fiber with an A in front. The A is an indication that amylase was used, and what that does through the extraction process actually aids in the complete removal of the starch to give us a true indication of fiber content. Neutral detergent fiber is roughly equivalent to the cell wall. Okay, and what we do is we take the representative sample and we boil it in solution, a neutral detergent solution, and the residue that's left after this boiling is the neutral detergent fiber. It represents the indigestible and slowly digestible components in that cell wall, which include cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, and ash, which a major component would be silica. Now, the importance of this factor when it comes to the actual animal is neutral detergent fiber is a predictor of dry matter intake. And just to give you a couple of examples here, there's a factor that's used, 120 is a factor that's used, and we divide it by the neutral detergent fiber of the sample. So in this particular case, 120 divided 40% neutral detergent fiber gives us 3% dry matter intake. So if we were to have a 150-pound ewe, the prediction would be if we take 150 times 3%, she'd be able to consume 4.5 pounds of dry matter of that particular forage. On the other hand, if we start looking at a nutrient-detergent factor of 60% and we divide that into 120, we get 2% dry matter intake. Therefore, that 150-pound ewe would only be able to consume 2% of 150, which would be 3 pounds. So there's a restriction then based on how much fiber there is in the sample in terms of her ability to consume that particular feedstuff. And this is an inverse relationship. And what this is, as you probably inferred then, is that the higher the neutral detergent fiber, the less the dry matter intake there will be. And a range of NDF would be as low as 10% in corn grain. And if we look at straw and we look at tropical grasses, you're going to find that they can be as high as 80% neutral detergent fiber. And so corn grain, a lot more potential intake because of low NDF as compared to something that's straw or tropical grasses because of the high NDF. So let's move on to another term called acid detergent fiber. And as you might surmise, that in this particular case, we're taking the residue that remains after boiling it in an acid detergent. And what happens then is it acidifies the hemicellulose. So within acid detergent fiber, we have cellulose, lignin, and silica. But again, the hemicellulose acidifies and is not part of the remaining residual after being in the laboratory. It too is highly indigestible and slowly digestible. And the importance of this, again, to you as the livestock owner, and more importantly then to the consuming sheep and goats, is it's used to calculate digestibility. So this might be total digestible nutrients, net energy of lactation, and again, it is an inverse relationship. So the lower the acid detergent fiber, the more digestible the forage will be. So again, in terms of extremes, it might be 3% in corn grain as a low value, which again, inverse, meaning that the low number, the more digestible it would be. And so corn, as we know, is very digestible. Whereas if we take a look at straw, which might have an acid detergent fiber of 50%, has a lot of the cellulose and lignin within it, we're going to find that it's not going to be as digestible. So I share this particular table with you for those of you that really want to delve into all the different types of terminologies that they are. This is probably the best graph representation, figure representation that I have seen that takes us from moisture and dry matter and starts breaking it down into ash and organic matter, and it talks about neutral detergent fiber and neutral detergent solubles and so forth. And this particular link that I have here is really an outstanding publication that talks about forage quality in some detail of what affects forage quality, and then excellent glossary with each of these terms. So if you really want to get into the full glossary of things, this is just an excellent figure here, and the link that's there has an excellent glossary associated with it. But we're not going to get into the detail of that tonight. So let's think about the year 2019. Very problematic in many, many different ways. We started out with a wet winter that just went into a wet spring, and a wet spring became a very wet early summer. And as a result, the hay that wanted to be cut, we typically try to have it cut by mid-May or late May, did not get harvested because of wet soils and persistent rains. And what happens then is this plant, we looked at what is affected. Well, maturity affects it. And so as a plant matures, it puts on more fiber, it puts on more cell wall, and as a result, we have a lesser quality product. And that's what a lot of you have, is a lesser quality product from this year's first harvest. A lot of you probably weren't celebrating watching fireworks on July 4 this year. You may have been tired from making hay because a lot of first cutting hay was not done until late June and early July. And so as a result of this, we have low protein and extremely high fiber. This probably in terms of across our states is probably one of the more problematic forage quality years that I've seen in my career. So what is the effect of forage maturity on forage intake and digestibility? Let's try to get into this slide here and tear it apart here to give you some better understanding of what happens. So if we look at the axis here on the horizontal, we find that we've got grasses and legumes, and we're taking them from being very leafy. This might be equivalent typically to late April into May. And then we get to the point that we're pre-bud with legumes and we're in the boot stage, just a few days away from shooting a seed head here. And then we get into heading, okay? And then we get into bud, we start having floral development, and then finally we get to the point that we're making some blooms, okay? We're creating some seed. And so if we follow this in, this particular line here is a representation of yield over the course of time. So again, this might be a representation of late April working into mid-June, and then beyond we'll get into some seed formation in late June and early July. If we take a look at over time, what happens then is digestibility is going to decline. And we also then find, because of increased amount of fiber as that plant matures, we also have a decline in dry matter intake. So again, as this plant matures, we have lesser digestibility and we have lesser amount of intake. Okay. So when we're harvesting it at immature, we have greater intake and digestibility, and when we get out to this particular stage and beyond, we have less intake and digestibility of the forage. So what are some things that could happen, and maybe, I hope they haven't happened, but for some of you maybe they are, that you don't test your forages and you don't supplement them correctly with needed protein and energy? Well, we can have weight loss, we can have poor gains, we can have weak lambs and kids, we can have poor colostrum quality, poor lactation, and so there's a host of things that can happen in this particular case if we're feeding a forage that does not meet the needs of the animal being fed. I appreciate Jason Tower at the Southern Indiana Purdue Ag Center for taking the tedious time of doing this particular task, but it's very much appreciated. And I think this, in a matter of a minute, will really tell you what the concern about low quality forage can be. So what we have here is a bucket of forage. We've got two buckets of the same forage. And what we're looking at is the estimated dry matter intake of this first cutting hay that was done in early July is what that ewe, 150-pound early lactating ewe, so specific to early lactation, she has the ability, because of the high fiber content, to only eat 2.76 pounds of that particular very low quality feed. Now, what does she need to eat? She needs to eat 5.49 pounds, and she's not capable of eating that amount of feed on a daily basis because it's so high in fiber. The rate of passage is so slow that she does not have the capacity to be eating that 5.5 pounds to meet the nutritional needs. So what we need to do, if this is the source of hay that we have, is this very low quality hay, then of course is to develop a ration with supplements that allow us then to meet that ewe's nutritional needs for her and her lambs. So the take-home message of my presentation tonight is what I like to call STAB. We're going to stab this hay for livestock health. And what the STAB stand for, I'd like to have you sample. So we're going to use a hay probe. We're going to take 20 probings from different bales of the same field and harvest. We're going to send them off to a certified laboratory to get a test back. And we're going to look at dry matter, crude protein, insoluble crude protein, which allows us then to have the adjusted crude protein value, nutrient-detergent fiber, acid-detergent fiber, and those of you particularly feeding a total mixed ration might like to request that minerals be requested as well. From those numbers then, we can look at the quality of hays that we have throughout the season, and what you'll learn in the second part of this presentation is that, depending on stage of animal, you're going to have different nutritional needs. And as a result, if you have a lower quality hay, that's a hay that would be best reserved for a ewe or a doe that's still in gestation, and your higher quality hay should be reserved for when she's lactating her young. So we're going to allocate that hay based on the results that you have. And then from that, if we're falling short in protein or we're falling short in energy, we're going to be adding different supplements to that hay to make sure that we meet the nutritional needs of the ewe and of the doe. So what we're going to do in the second half of the presentation here, and I'm willing to accept some questions now from all of you, so take the time to do the chat, and we'll take a little time to separate them out and answer some questions. But after that's done, I'm going to pass the opportunity to be your next speaker to Dr. Richard Earhart. He is the Michigan State University Small Ruminant Specialist, and he'll help us develop some rations dependent upon the quality of hay that you happen to have. Yes. So we're getting prepared here for some questions. Dr. Neary's getting mic'd up.
Okay. I hope you can hear fine. Had a little concern about the volume earlier. I think we're straightened out. Just got a couple questions right now. Of course, if you've got them, keep sending them in. We'll ask them later. One question was, what about rained-on hay?
Absolutely. So that's part of the environmental piece that I was mentioning in terms of effect. And so if we're talking about hay that's been harvested and laying in the swath or in the windrow, if it's in the swath, we're going to be, again, leaching soluble carbohydrates, the simple sugars. We'll be leaching some of the nutrients. So rained upon hay is going to be lesser quality. And so that's why it's very, very important to be weather aware and try to avoid that as much as possible, which then, if we think about trying to reduce rained upon hay, this is where we look at, again, being weather-wise. And then we look at the potential use of using a tedder, which fluffs the hay to hurry up dry down. And this is in part, I think, Mike, why these baleage, the bales in a tube or big marshmallows, that we wrap and ferment, is essentially the amount of time to get them from field moisture to a moisture of 50% that we can wrap is going to be about half the time as compared to cutting it and taking it to a safe moisture of 18% for a large round bale or 20% for rectangular bales. So that in part is one of the ways. But yes, rained on hay is particularly deleterious to quality. And the closer you are to being made into the bale, the lesser or the more problem it's going to be. So if you get a 1/10 of an inch of rain on a crop that's just been cut, the effect of that is not near as much as getting an inch of rain then or as it gets close to being put into the package.
Okay. Second question is, if you have carryover hay from one year to the next, is there value in retesting that? Okay. Or should you retest that?
Okay. I think if we look at hay that's been properly stored, so if it hasn't been out in the weather and it actually is under storage and hasn't had deterioration occur, we're going to find that probably its quality is going to be very similar from year to year. On the other hand, if it's outside, it's going to have more deterioration that's going to occur from year to year. And I'm sure many of you have seen, unfortunately, bales that have been out for many, many years, and you can just see them decompose in front of your eyes as time goes by. So it depends on where they've been stored. You know, I can tell the story that my father had some hay in storage for approximately 35 years, and it was under storage all those years. He retired. Hay came out of the barn at the farm sale, and it looked as good as the day it went in 35 years previous. Lost a little vitamin A through all of that, but again, no rain upon it and good storage. So it depends on the condition.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and you know, some people think that protein and energy just mysteriously evaporate, and they're always concerned about, gosh, the hay is 2 years old, and you know, should I be concerned about it? Well, no, if it's been under storage and it hasn't had any deterioration, don't let that be the factor of why you don't purchase some hay.
Okay, another question that came in is, are there benchmark values for ADF, etc., I'm assuming ADF, NDF, that one should be looking for on a forage analysis? A very good question.
Yeah, very good question. And, you know, I'll let Dr. Earhart get into the specifics of that, and that maybe is one you want to tap into. But, you know, the one that I can tell you now that going to another industry, if I look at the dairy industry, and for those of you that have dairy goats, this factor probably is true there as it is with dairy cattle. But in that particular case, I like the 20-30-40 rule. The 20 is 20% crude protein, the 30 is 30% acid detergent fiber, and the 40 is neutral detergent fiber. Those 20, 30, 40 work pretty well if you're looking at a excellent quality hay for lactation purposes. Now, if I look at a value that we didn't talk about, and you'll see an analysis called the relative feed value, you can't balance a ration with that, but it allows me as a buyer, Mike, to work with you as the seller of the hay, and I can look at that value and get an idea of whether it's targeted better for maintenance use for does or ewes as compared to maybe being fed in early lactation. And you know, a really high quality grass, probably its relative feed value is going to be around 90. A super good alfalfa for lactation purposes in a lactating herd is going to be, you know, somewhere around 145. So
it's quite a range.
It's a huge range, and all of the things that we talked about play into that. But yes, there are some benchmarks that one would look for, and again, they predict from a fiber value. NDF again predicts the intake, and acid detergent fiber predicts the digestibility.
Okay, another question is, does it matter what time after the hay is baled the stabs are taken for samples to be tested? Hours, days, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's best, and that's a very good question, because really the right time to be doing that is to let it get through its curing process. So in other words, the day that you bale that hay, it may be 18% moisture, and or it may not. It may be higher than that. And so you want to get it to the point of equilibration, and that's going to take approximately several weeks for that to get down to that 12 or 13% moisture that it equilibrates at. So I'd preferably, you know, let a month pass if it's in storage. Now, if it's outside, I think preferably you'd let it be stabbed, sampled as close to feeding as possible. So a lot of people, what they will do is get their harvest of the season done, put it into storage, so you know that this particular space, you know, where it's stored is this particular hay from this particular cutting. So when you come back, you can sample them individually and representatively, and do that at the end of the season. So really a good time to do this is, you know, the month of October, early November, before you're feeding any of that hay as you get into the late fall and winter.
Okay, and then one last question so far. Now, just a word about the questions. If you still have some, still send them in. Dr. Johnson's agreed to stay on, and he will help answer questions at the end of Dr. Earhart's presentation. We know it takes a little while for for the questions to get entered and get to us from the viewing stations. That's just part of the technical glitches in it, but that's just the way it is, so we'll deal with it. So please feel free to continue to ask questions. The last questions I have for you right now is just an open-ended question. It says, what about TDN?
Okay. TDN is a measure of total digestible nutrients, and again, it's predicted by this acid detergent fiber value that laboratories will do. It's actually a predictor in that particular case, but if we go back to the strategies of analysis, it takes a look at all the digestible components of the forage and total them together to give you that TDN. And you know, in some livestock circles, that'll be used as what's used to balance rations, and others, they'll look at the net energy of gain and maintenance and lactation and use that as their approach. So again, I think it depends on the livestock species you're working with and particular nutritionists, whether they use TDN to derive the energy value or whether it's maintenance or gain.
Okay. All right, like I said, keep sending questions
Please.
in. We'll get to them. Some of them may overlap with the next speaker as well. We're going to take a very short break here. Our next speaker is coming from Michigan State, so we've got to get them up and online. So just a few minutes, and we'll be back online and ready to talk about the next topic about this hay quality, and so we'll be on in just a few minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If this thing's red, I guess they can still hear me, right? Okay, because I looked at this, I thought, shit, it's not green, it's red.
Yeah, I'm here.
It's showing the Scott is muted. Mike,
What's that?
tell him that Scott's showing is muted.
Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I'm here. Okay, I can hear another person now.
It's showing the Scott is.
I'm ready. This is Richard. Okay. Um, Pardon? Okay. Thank you.
Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Okay.
You gotta have a mic. Just grab.
Okay. All right, we're back. I promised it was a short break, and it was a short break. Okay, so just like the first presentation, please submit your questions that you may have, and we will certainly answer as many as we can. The next speaker is Dr. Richard Earhart. Richard's a small ruminant specialist from Michigan State University. We really appreciate Dr. Earhart's participation in this webinar. The first presentation kind of gave the problems of the hay for the year. This particular presentation, Dr. Earhart will talk about some solutions for using the hay you got, even if it's low quality. So he will discuss the topic of let's create value from forage tests by developing rations. So Dr. Earhart, thank you for coming on, and we'll turn it over to you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mike. Thanks. I just appreciate this opportunity to reach a little different audience, and appreciate Mike Neary inviting me and the opportunity to follow such a great presentation from Keith Johnson. So I'm getting some feedback here. Okay, I will move forward. So today I'm going to talk about some of the strategies to manage forage quality limitations when you're feeding your sheep and goats. And yeah, as Mike said, I'm in the sheep and goat specialist at Michigan State University for about 10 years. And as an overview, I'm going to talk about the impact of forage quality on sheep and goat health and productivity. Then I'm going to switch over to some of the strategies you can use to cope with this forage quality limit. And then also I'm going to talk about options to gain greater control over forage quality. Yeah, I'm just going to try to hit my volume here so I can hear myself think a little better. Just a second. Just hold on a second here. Okay, I think that's what I needed to do. And I can move ahead now. Sorry about that interruption. Okay, so I'm going to talk about strategies to deal with forage quality, and then talk about maybe a whole different strategy to consider in maybe gaining greater control over your forage quality for future years. Okay, so forage quality, put simply, it's really a major thing that determines the nutritional status of your animals. Any ruminant animal in a forage-based feeding program, that's really the key element. It determines their immune status, their resistance to disease challenges, and certainly their reproductive capacity, everywhere from the conception rate to what happens during pregnancy, and then postnatally as well. Milk production, growth of lambs, they're all affected by forage quality. It really determines, the amount of supplement that you need to add. And so it kind of sets the stage for the cost of your diet, since supplements tend to be fairly expensive, although in some terms, sometimes forages are too. It also determines the animal's feed intake, as Dr. Johnson did a nice job of explaining, which really sets a limit on performance and health as well. So as described, forage quality, really the focus point is what's happening in the cell wall component of the plant. So here I'm showing a plant cell wall. It's that cell wall component composed of these various fractions of cellulose, lignin, which is really highly indigestible fiber. And so the digestibility of this cell wall component, which is the fiber again, determines the amount of energy and nutrition that the animals will get. So forages can meet the needs of animals if they're highly digestible and high quality. For example, here's just a picture of some sheep on a pasture on a farm I used to own in New York, just about ready to give lamb in late May. So just about ready to lamb in late May. This is really high quality forage, and these sheep are going to have about 2 lambs per ewe. And even in those high demanding situations, the digestibility of this forage and quality is so good that these animals don't need supplementation, and they even gain a little bit of weight on pasture. And that's exceptional forage quality. It's really hard to maintain that, though, in a stored forage program, isn't it? So some of the factors that determine fiber digestibility, it's all about maturity, as mentioned. And, more vegetative plants are much more digestible. Other things that contribute are growing temperature and the species, of course. Cool season grasses are going to tend to be like most of our pasture species. In our part of the world are going to tend to be more digestible than those warmer seed grasses, which have a whole different photosynthetic pathway. Legumes are also different than grasses and have a different type of fiber fraction. I'll discuss that just a little bit. So as was already introduced, the important measures of fiber quality are going to be something we call NDF, which is neutral detergent fiber, which really is this whole cell wall fraction. It's kind of like a good aggregate measure of fiber. And again, it's negatively associated with intake. So the animal intake is dependent on the fiber level. Even more clear, though, the digestibility of this fiber varies from fiber source to fiber source. So I'll discuss a little bit. And so that actually is even a better indicator of feed intake, is how digestible this fiber, this NDF, is. And then a true measure of the more indigestible component of fiber is something called acid detergent fiber. It's composed of largely the indigestible aspects of cellulose and lignin, and it's definitely not negatively correlated digestibility. So when you have high ADFs, you definitely have a poorly digestible forage. And so that's another consideration. And the NDF concentration is often used as a quality target for harvest. So if you're harvesting forages and you want high quality and reasonable yield, generally we want to keep like alfalfa in the upper 30s, certainly not more than 40. And grasses, we don't want to see them go much over 55. Keeping around 50, you get a really nicely digestible. So they're not quite the same targets. They're different types of fiber that they have. So we have different targets for NDF levels when we harvest. Now, most of the grasses, the poor quality forages we're talking about that are problematic this year and problematic any year you can't get in and harvest your hay on time because of weather considerations, they're going to be well into the 60s. So they creep very quickly upward each week of the year in the spring. So in terms of forage evaluation, I'm going to use some fairly simple terms here. One of them is a measure of energy, and that is called, I'm going to use the term total digestible nutrients, which you can get on a forage report. And it's equivalent to metabolizable energy or similar to metabolizable energy. And again, important to understand that fiber digestibility is a really big determining factor of the energy content of your forages. So the more digestible the fiber is, the higher the TDN, the higher metabolizable energy, the more energy is available to the animals. Crude protein follows the same lines. Typically, the most digestible forages are going to have higher protein as well. So they go together pretty nicely. Now, as far as, allocating your forage inventory, that's an important consideration to have. Anytime we have hay, we tend to, many farms are going to have some that's pretty good, some that's medium, and some that's poor. I know it's been shifted more towards low quality this last year, but it's important to understand that if you have a variation in quality, what animals are going to be needing it more than others. So as far as high quality forage goes, we want to feed that to your prolific animals, those that are having twins, triplets, and that really needs to be reserved for late pregnancy and lactation. And they really need this higher digestibility. Their intake might be limited, especially particularly during late pregnancy. A medium quality forage can fit a few more slots. We can use it to grow replacement animals, whether rams use bucks or does when they're over in that post-weaning phase, well into it. Can also feed it to less prolific animals. So if we have animals that are having singles, mostly in late pregnancy and lactation, if you have knowledge of that, or some like what we occasionally do at the university here is we'll scan and we'll get fetal numbers on animals and we'll feed them accordingly. Or if you just know the animals are less prolific, you can feed those lower quality forage too. They don't have nearly the same needs. And then animals that are in this flushing period and during the first months of pregnancy, they could use some decent quality forage. It doesn't have to be quite as high quality as maybe the need for late pregnancy and lactation. So if you're going to allocate, this is how I would do it. The best stuff for late pregnancy and lactation, medium for these other states. And as far as low quality, well, this would be, if you had a choice, you'd like to reserve it for animals at maintenance. And again, if you have a choice. This would be a mature ram after he's recovered from breeding and maybe up until say about a month before breeding. Use from weaning to about 3 weeks before mating, and then use during this mid-pregnancy window. They are on more of a maintenance diet. And then another interesting thing is, and you may well be aware that we can use this low-quality forage actually as a fiber source for animals on a concentrate diets. So when you have animals that you have on finishing diets, on a grain-based diet, using some of this low-quality forage is actually advantageous because they need like a little bit of fiber, or they do well with a little bit of fiber to retain rumen function. So that's another way that you can use it. And if you have finishing animals, and you throw them some poor quality forage, they just gobble it up because they're kind of craving a little bit of fiber in their diet. Some general guidelines for matching grass and legume forage quality at stage of production are shown here. There's a lot of information here, so it's meant kind of as a reference, but hopefully get kind of an overview that maintenance, we can have much lower TDN, lower crude protein. Animals really don't have very high requirements for adult animals that are maintaining their weight. So remember, maintenance is that stage when adults, where they're not growing, they're just maintaining weight. Their nutrient needs are fairly modest. Late pregnancy, again, the needs are very much determined by the how many kids or lambs are being carried by the animal. It could be vary from singles to triplets or even greater. And again, those triplets are going to have much greater requirements because of that large mass of the pregnant uterus and the limitations you see combined with the limitations you see in intake that happen in late pregnancy in these kind of litter-bearing animals. Lactation, we want to make sure we meet the needs of lactation, particularly early lactation, to make these animals grow well and stay healthy and so the difference between lactation and pregnancy, there's a couple of major differences. In lactation, intake naturally expands. The animal's voluntary intake goes up, but there's also a greater need for protein during lactation. If you want the animals to milk optimally, that's when you need a little higher protein. That can be met with forage protein sources or some protein supplements you can provide as well. So that's an important consideration. So with low quality forage, the amount that can be used is really proportional to the needs of the animal. okay? So if the animals need a lot of feed, a high plane of nutrition, you can't use that much low quality forage in your diet. You're going to have to do some substitution strategies I'll talk about next, because there's no real magic method to make low quality forage better. It is what it is. You can reduce the chop length, so you can grind it. Some of the large producers I work with chop their low quality forage. The animals consume it better. They don't waste as much. However, do you really want your animals consuming that much low quality feed? Depends on their production state. It's good for maintenance. You'll definitely get a lot more use out of the feed. They'll waste less of it, so that's good. But maybe you still have to set a limit to how much you feed to animals with greater requirements, because there's not going to be any gain realized when animals are fed below their requirements. You can't really starve a profit with animals. And I was talking to my wife about this morning. She said, what kind of solutions are you going to give these people when maybe they should just throw their low quality forage away? And I said, well, these guys from Purdue, they want me to give these guys some solutions. So that's not a great solution. But, I thought it was an interesting point. And I said, sometimes the best thing you can do with some low quality forage is to find some other uses for it. And there is value in using it for bedding, certainly. When I was in New York and we had a lot of low quality forage, a lot of patriotic hay, as Dr. Johnson said, cut out well after the 4th of July, I used to buy that and use it for bedding when I could, because I could get it pretty cheap. It can also be part of a composting program. Like when you do mortality composting, if you do that with your farm, it's another thing that you can use there. So there are other ways that you can utilize this low quality hay and still get some fertilizer value out of it, certainly. And maybe replace some of your bedding needs. The issues with low quality forage are, again, that it's just full of indigestible fiber. It's full of lignin, indigestible cellulose. That really has kind of a real double whammy, because it not only limits the intake, because that passage as described through the animals is going to be limited. It's also just low in density. It doesn't have a lot of energy density. So the energy intake is going to be low because it's dilute and they can't eat too much of it. So I'm going to give you kind of a thumbnail sketch of some suggested limits in using low quality forage according to your animal class. When I talk about low quality forage, I'm talking about forage that has NDF well in the 60s, and it's going to be that kind of mature forage harvested late June through July, when the plants are pretty much totally mature and kind of fallen over in your hayfield. We're talking. We can use a lot of it in maintenance feeding, although animals are going to waste a fair bit. So it can be fed, be their primary diet. We have to watch it, though, when any maintenance feeding, as I'll mention, to make sure it's truly maintenance feeding. Because if you're feeding animals in the dead of winter, some of these diets, they still might need some supplementation because it's cold outside, or maybe they're working a little harder. So it can form the majority of their diet, but sometimes they possibly could use some supplementation. I would say we can use it up to 50-60% in ewes or does that are carrying or rearing singles. Again, these are just some rough figures. And then when I do my calculations on nutrient requirements and utilizing these forages, accounting for their fiber levels, I find that you need to limit it to about 40 to 50% of the diet when you have ewes or does carrying or rearing twins, or growing ewe lambs or doelings in those kind of stages. Now, I'll give you some examples of this just in a few minutes. And then if you have ewes or does rearing triplets, you really have to limit it even further. So its usefulness goes way down, the higher the needs of the animals become, of course. Feeding it above this limit that I suggest is definitely going to limit the energy and protein intake. And the negative consequences of this are many. Low birth weight, weak lambs, are not going to have the same energy stores. The ewes and the does aren't going to have as much colostrum. They're not going to milk as well. And then you run at a risk of what you guys are probably familiar with, both ketosis or pregnancy toxemia, which becomes a big problem when underfed animals in late pregnancy. poor growth of animals, and then smaller litters because the animals aren't going to have, they're going to lose lambs during pregnancy, and they're just not probably going to ovulate as well if they're not flushed properly either. So aggregate, adding it all up, you get smaller litters. So what can you do to make the most out of a poor quality forage inventory? Primary thing is to use a replacement strategy. You can use some energy concentrates. However, you have to be cautious when using energy concentrates in that, you know, they're largely starch based and you have to be careful how they're fed. You want a maximum, I would say, is another rule of thumb of about 40% of the diet. And I prefer to keep it less than that with some other strategies if I could. You can also use, I'm going to introduce this now, a non-forage fiber source. Okay, so it's a source of fiber. It's kind of like forage, but it's not forage. A great example would be soy hull feed, which I think is my favorite because it's very digestible, high in digestible energy, an excellent fiber source, generally pretty easy to get in the Midwest, and generally not that expensive, especially when you evaluate it compared to the cost of buying hay of similar quality. And it can replace a fair bit of hay in the diet. Another choice are oats. I would say they're less ideal. They're lower in energy. They're not quite as digestible. And they're often kind of expensive. But if they're not expensive to you, they can be a good source. Okay, so if you can get oats cheap, that's another possibility. Or, and probably better, you use a combination of these energy concentrates in graded doses and some non-forage fiber sources to make up some of this fiber needs of the animal and to meet their energy needs. The other kind of strategy I like to consider is, hey, you need to allow a higher level of forage waste to let the animals be more selective. When you look at a bale of hay, even if it's low quality, there's going to be some good stuff in there. So if you allow the animals to be a little more selective, it's not a bad strategy either. So you need to kind of factor in some waste fractions and think about the waste as maybe substituting some bedding for you. So sheep and goats, next concept is that sheep and goats need adequate energy. However, the form of energy can also be important. So there's different forms of energy in diets. One form is starch. This is going to, again, come from these energy concentrates. And if you have a lot of starch in your diet, it's kind of a risky situation because sudden changes in intake can lead to acidosis, animals will go off feed, or they can even, suffer from overeating disease, can trigger, it can lead to death. And, it's a serious problem. So you have to be careful when you substitute starch, because if you just throw a bunch of corn in front of the animals and you don't give them enough feeder space, some of them are going to eat a whole lot and some of them aren't going to get any. And it's difficult. You have to feed starch feeds very carefully as well. So there's some feeding issues in feeding starchy feeds. So high starch diets are definitely very useful in a growing finishing stage, but I'm going to give you kind of a limit to how much you want to feed them to adults. And I would say you definitely don't want to have over 40% of the diet, especially in a single feeding. In fact, I'd say it's better if you split it into a couple feedings. If you need to feed them, and I'll talk about that need in just a minute, over 30%, so that you avoid some of these risk factors. Then high energy fiber feeds, for example, soy hulls, beet pulp, and wheat midds. My favorite, again, is soy hulls, and it's the one I have the most familiarity with. They're another way to supplement energy without the risk of rumen disturbance. So this is different than starch, still a reasonably high energy feed, but it comes from fiber, digestible fiber. In fact, you can take lambs off a pasture diet, stick them on a self-feeder of soy hulls, and they do fine. That's how safe it is. I do it every year, and it's a great way to get animals onto a grain-based diet. It's also like so it's really a source of kind of high quality hay, but not with the particle length that you see from hay, of course. So another important concept to recognize is that this fiber fraction of the diet varies in terms of its digestibility. So NDF, not all NDF was created the same. So all ruminants crave fiber, they certainly do, but excessive indigestible fiber can limit intake. So forage NDF, so the NDF coming from forage tends to be pretty filling compared to some non-forage NDF sources. For example, soy hull feed, soy hull pellets, soy hulls, as I just described, are a form of NDF that's very digestible and the particle size is small. Animals can eat quite a bit of it, whereas the NDF that comes from forage is a little more filling. So I want to consider the forage NDF a little different than other NDF sources. So in that, I would recommend, it's just a concept, is to limit the total forage NDF in your diets to about 35% when you're trying to maximize the intake of the animals. Because if you don't, they won't be able to eat enough. When are those states present? Basically two primary ones. Again, emphasize it one more time. Late pregnancy in animals carrying twins or more, and lactation in the same animals. That's when they need to have a limited NDF intake. You can't have them, especially from forage. So animals like this, and this picture I just took last night actually in my own barn. So you can see when I get home tonight, I'm probably going to see some lambs on the ground. These kind of animals are going to have limited intake capacity. They certainly do. So they need some higher quality forages that are high in digestibility. You can't provide all their energy needs in the form of corn. You have to have some higher quality forages. So these animals that I'm feeding here, I left my best quality forage for these animals. And I'm feeding my maintenance animals in a different part of my barn, the lower quality forage. My best stuff I'm feeding to these guys because they really need it. I'm also giving them some soy hull feed to make sure their NDF, their forage NDF isn't too high in their diet, and some corn as well. So let's talk about some examples of some of these replacement strategies. Let's look at a ewe, medium-sized ewe, carrying twins in late pregnancy. So if we look up her requirements in one of the feed tables, we'll find that she's going to need to eat about 3% of her body weight. That turns out to be about 4.5 pounds of dry matter. Okay. If we look at her energy needs, that equates to close to 3 pounds of total digestible nutrients. And she needs about this much protein. Her protein needs aren't that great in late pregnancy. They become much greater as soon as she gives birth. And if we keep our forage NDF less than 35% of the diet, that'll be a good plan too, so that she can eat enough to meet her needs. So let's assume that our forage source is this low quality hay. This stuff with the high NDF, low TDN, low protein. Okay. So a solution you come up with is you could feed them some of this low quality hay. You have to allow some waste. You want to supplement some corn grain. Then I'm going to give her a fair bit of soy hull feed, more than you might normally need to feed because I'm replacing effectively some of this hay, which is with another fiber source that's much more digestible, for soy hulls. And I'm going to add some soybean meal because this hay, unfortunately, is only 10% protein. So she is going to need some protein supplement. So when I do the calculations, turns out this diet is about 32% of its NDF comes from forage, which isn't bad. It's lower than that threshold I mentioned. So she's going to be able to eat this 3% of her body weight that she needs. She's going to have adequate protein and energy. And this turns out that this diet's about 45% low quality forage, about 25% soybean meal and corn. It's not that high, the starch. And it has about 35% of the diet's going to be soy hulls, which are going to replace some of that fiber that she needs to keep going. Let's consider a case of goats now. Their lactating goats are either milking hard for the parlor, or in case of maybe meat goats, rearing twins or even triplets. In this case, these animals are going to eat a lot. These animals' voluntary intake's pretty high, it can approach 5% even. And so you think about her needs, she's going to want to eat a lot. We want to make sure she can eat a lot so she can milk like crazy. And these are going to be her needs. So she's going to need a fair bit of energy, a fair bit of protein. And again, we want to set that NDF level so it's not too high, so she can actually realize this intake level. Okay. Otherwise, she won't be able to meet her the goals you'd have for her production. So again, we have poor quality forage, the same patriotic hay that we keep feeding these animals, because unfortunately, that's what we were able to make last summer. And then if we, as a solution to this problem, I have her being able to, and we're allowing her to waste even more. Okay, she's going to actually eat only about 3 pounds of hay, because we're going to allow her 4 pounds. She's only going to eat 3. She's going to eat a fair bit of corn, a fair bit of soy hulls, and again, some soybean meal. Fair bit of soybean meal. It's a pretty high level. It's going to cost some money to feed these animals, but if you don't meet her needs, she's going to suffer. You're going to suffer as well. So the diet here is going to be about 34% forage NDF with a fair bit of protein, which they need to milk well, and a fairly high energy diet. So now you've got this down to only 40% of her diet's a low quality forage, but at least you're utilizing the source, because assuming you don't have other options, again, other options would be better, but let's just pretend we don't have those options, and we're making do with what we've got. Okay, and I've had to do this a few times in the past myself, so it isn't an experience that I haven't had to deal with also. Let's talk about some growing animals now, some growing ewe lambs. Turns out that these animals have similar needs to the animals during late pregnancy. They don't need a ton of protein. They need some decent form of energy. These animals are going to be able to eat to a greater extent of their body weight, because they're not constricted by a pregnant uterus and by the metabolic problems of late pregnancy. So they're going to be able, they're going to eat about 3 pounds of TDN, a reasonable amount of protein. And again, we want them to be able to realize their intakes. We want to keep that forage NDF less than 35%. Again, we're feeding the same poor quality forage, and we're going to allow some waste. We're going to supplement with soy hulls, soybean meal, and corn. And in this solution, the diet's going to be about 34% forage NDF with appropriate protein and energy. This diet's going to be, again, in that 40 range, 42 range of low quality hay with some concentrate and a fair bit of non-forage fiber to make sure she can meet her energy needs. Now, during maintenance, here's some animals on my own farm that are eating some average quality forage in the middle of winter. These animals are in mid-pregnancy, they're coasting along. Their needs aren't so great. They need to certainly maintain their weight. They're being housed outwintered outdoors without much of a windbreak, so there is a need for energy there, but it's not anything like it would be late pregnancy or lactation, right? And they're not growing. There aren't any ewe lambs in here. These are all mature ewes. So an example replacement strategy here, well, this is pretty simple, okay? These animals, well, it's hard to know exactly what they're going to eat as a percentage of body weight. That's pretty much determined by the quality of their forage, but let's say it's sort of 2 to 3%. They don't have very high protein requirements. Their energy requirements aren't necessarily very high unless they're housed in cold, driving winds. Same poor quality forage. In this case, we might be able to feed them just the poor quality forage, allow a little less waste, but I would watch these animals carefully, and like you should always monitor your nutrition programs of your animals and supplement them maybe with some soy hulls or possibly a little bit of corn grain, just to keep their body weight up. So I'd monitor their body condition score and alter the soy hull amount based on their condition score and whether there's big fluctuations in temperature. Okay. So to summarize that, summarize our feeding strategies here for this low quality forage. You need to allow more waste or greater selectivity. You need to allocate the inventory according to the needs of the animals. Again, low quality to these animals on maintenance, that are coasting, high quality when you have it to the late pregnant lactating animals, or limit that amount of low quality forage to those animals. And substitute some energy concentrate, but you should never keep it over 40% to these adults because it can cause fluctuations in intake and it's kind of dangerous. You should keep your forage NDF levels to less than 35% of the total diet. Okay, so when you feed these prolific animals in late pregnancy and lactation, pointed that out a few times, and you should use high energy non-forage fiber supplements to replace some of this hay. In fact, you can replace a lot of the hay. There's some farmers, some producers that actually feed their ewes a soy hull based diet. They put self feeders in their barns, fill them with soy hulls, let the animals eat all they can, and then they feed them a little bit of low quality hay on the side just to give them a fiber source. They like that system because the animals never make any noise because they're always on self feeders. So they're not howling at you, screaming for corn. They milk really well and they breed back well, like on accelerated lambing programs. So you'll find like a lot of producers in the Pipestone program in Western Minnesota do this strategy. I've got a few producers in my part of the world who do the same thing. So it can replace a lot of your hay. And when you look at the cost of, there's a labor issue. It's pretty easy to fill your self feeders up. Doesn't take much time. And the cost of it, many soy hull feed is sort of $150, $175 a dry matter ton. It's very high quality. That's often cheaper than the same forage that you can get in the form of hay, dry hay. So it can be a good deal as well. I want to change chapters here just for a minute for the last part of my talk and talk about maybe some other strategies you might evaluate, consider for you as an alternative forage system for the future for your farm. So I would ask, is silage feeding an option for your farm? If it is, it's one you could consider because it'll alleviate many of the forage quality concerns. But the primary thing you have to understand and recognize is you need a certain number of animals to consume the silage fast enough so it doesn't spoil. And that's really important. And a lot of sheep and goat producers don't really have enough animals to make that a reality. So it's not a perfect solution. But I just want to introduce it if you haven't thought of it. I find a lot of producers don't realize this could be a good option for them, even large producers. And the advantages of silage are pretty clear. You have control over the cutting date. That gives you control over forage quality because most of forage quality is determined by cutting date. You don't need a lot of drying time. In the summer, it can be you can cut and bale on the same day. In the spring, it could take 2 days, but certainly a lot less than dry hay. So you're able to squeeze in forage harvest when quality is at its best. Okay. It will lessen the risk of crop loss because you have this smaller time factor for harvest, and you definitely can improve you can reduce the harvest loss. You can get greater yield and quality from your fields if you create silage. But here's just kind of a summary of what kind of numbers of animals that you might need for different silage sources, okay? So you need to have enough animals to keep that face of your silage fresh. They need to be able to keep up with the silage and eat it fast enough before it spoils. So that differs the number of animals to whether you're talking about a bunk silo, a egg bag, or a 4x4 brown bale of hay. So if you're talking, you're going to fill a silage bunk up, you need a lot of animals to make that work. If you feed 2 silage sources, haylage and corn, which many farms would want to do, you'd need even more animals. You need about 600 or 800 animals to really make that buzz. You can get by with fewer animals if you have egg bags, but still, that's a fair number of animals. But look down here at a 4x4 baled silage. This is just like about 5 to 600 pounds of dry matter. Those animals about 40 does and about 30 ewes can eat that in a reasonable amount of time to keep it from spoiling. So that can be a fit for a medium-sized farm. I have experience. I've been feeding baled silage on my own farm ever since I started raising sheep, really. And it's been a good solution for me. I've got about 200 ewes, and so I have no problem keeping up with quality. And I can always get my first cutting hay done before the beginning of June. Even this year, I was able to do it. I just had just enough days to do it, even with this crappy torrential downpours we had. It still was hard, but it made a big difference. And then I'm able to have the quality harvest, again, late June in a timely manner to really harvest this high quality stuff throughout the year. You can make dry hay the rest of the year, but that first cutting is especially helpful if you can take a cutting of silage off. However, I'm not going to deny that there aren't some health risks in feeding silage. There certainly are. For sheep and goats are very susceptible to some silage-borne diseases. The principal one is listeriosis. This is a soil-borne organism. It'll grow really well in silage that isn't well fermented, where you don't have the pH low enough. And it's caused when the silage gets dirt in the silage, followed by bad fermentation conditions. So that can come from just baling it too dry, getting holes in the wrap. All these sorts of things can happen, not having a tight enough bale. And sheep and goats are quite susceptible, much more than cattle. Cattle can handle this much better. Sheep and goats doesn't take much to make them sick. You're going to see some clusters over time. It takes about 3 weeks before you see an animal get sick from listeriosis based on when it consumed the bacteria. And I have to be clear that there can be catastrophic losses. If you've got poorly managed silage, I know a few producers who made corn silage, they stuck it right on the earth, the ground, didn't cover it well, fed it to their sheep and lost a lot of animals. However, more typically, if you do a good job with your silage management, manage the mold, maybe don't feed a few bales that had holes in them, you're going to have pretty low losses. And most producers I know, in fact, all producers who stick with this, feel that the benefits outweigh the risk because of the much better quality nutrition and lower feed costs you have with that system. So again, for a smaller farm, you'd want to really try to source these individually wrapped bales. We can buy these, at least where I live, reasonably transportable. We get people who can transport them to you, and you want to be able to feed them in cold weather, because if there's any holes in the wrappers that occur, if it's during cold weather, it's not such a big deal, but it can be a good forage source, even buying this stuff in the middle of winter. Here's just an example of a field that my neighbor asked me to come over and get his first cutting hay. He's a crop farmer, he's too busy, and he said, hey, and it got to be into June, and he said, do you want to buy this stuff in the field? And I said, well, it's getting a little mature, but sure, I'll give it a go. So I baled it. Some of it is baled silage, and it turned out to be pretty dry, a couple dry days there, and I let the rest of the crop go to dry hay. So it's the same cutting, baled silage or dry hay. You can see that the baled silage crude protein's higher, the NDF is lower, the digestibility is better, the relative feed value is greater, and the harvest loss was far less, baling the same crop as baled silage compared to dry hay, because there was a fair bit of alfalfa in this crop. You have very low leaf loss with baled silage. So most of the high quality stuff you're harvesting, and you have very little harvest loss, and you capture most of the good quality. So it does make a pretty big difference. Some other considerations are in how you feed it. Well, first of all, let me give you the pros and cons. So it's going to give you timely harvest, which is the key control factor for quality. You get more quality forage over a season than you ever will in a dry forage program. And it's going to minimize the loss and storage losses. The other thing is you don't have to store it in a barn. So suddenly you can put more sheep in your barn and have more animals because you can store it outside because it's wrapped in plastic. Okay. So storage issues are less. But the disadvantages are it requires a critical number of animals to feed it at a sufficient rate, and it isn't that easy to handle. These bales weigh a lot. You can't have you have to have a larger lift capacity of your tractor or whatever you use to feed to handle them. And if you're a larger farm, they can be more difficult to process, although many of the more modern hay bales have cutter knives that can process them, and that becomes less of an issue. But they certainly are harder to process than other feed forms. Okay. They can be fed just like dry hay bales with bale feeders. This picture here on the right is taken in the middle of July. So this is the middle of summer on a farm in northern Michigan. They leave their wrapper around the bale so that it retards spoilage. And these lambs are eating it from the top, and they eventually eat it all, and it doesn't spoil. A lot of the spoilage happens from the bedded pack going up, so leaving the wrapper on works really well. Here's the farm I used to have when my boys were younger, and we could process it in our center aisle feeding system, bring bales in there, split them, and feed pretty quickly. So just to summarize everything here, what I'd like to emphasize is that you need to reserve your poor quality forage to animals that need maintenance when you can. But when you're forced to use it for different reasons, you can use these high energy non-forage fiber sources like soy hulls to substitute a lot of the hay needs in your diets, which might be an economical way to go as well. You can use energy concentrates, and you should when animals need it, but you can't go over a certain threshold, or you'll run into problems. And I'd say finally, we want to consider maybe an alternative feeding program, because this issue does not go away. Even though last year was a bad year, it was wet, every May is always more wet than the rest of the year, and this always is an issue. So consider silage feeding if you have enough animals. This gives you a lot better control over forage quality. And so, yep, that concludes my presentation. Here's my contact information. I'd be glad to entertain any questions if there are any.
Okay, Richard, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. I got a little feedback here.
Okay. Is that better?
Yeah, it's better. Yep.
Okay.
I
I've
can
got
hear
a
you
few
pretty well.
questions for you, and probably have a few more roll in. One question is, can low moisture lick tubs be used for goat supplementation? I'm assuming protein tubs there.
So the question was, can you use lick tubs?
Can low moisture lick tubs be used for goat supplementation? That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, you can certainly use lick tubs. They're mostly, a lot of the energy comes from molasses. They're often supplemented with some protein as well. I'm not sure they're always going to be the cheapest form of supplementation, but they can be an effective supplement. But they they can only substitute a certain fraction of your dry hay, because there's no fiber in them.
Right.
So they do certainly, they are a strategy. I think I'd have to look at the economics of it critically just to see if that's the best way to go.
Okay, another question is there any need to supplement grain if forage quality is high based on results from the analysis?
I'm sorry, Mike, I couldn't quite catch that. Can you repeat
Okay,
it?
yeah. Is there any need to supplement grain if forage quality is high based upon the analysis results?
Oh, okay. Well, if the forage quality is high, depends on the animals you're feeding and what their requirements are. I think I pointed out early on in that talk, if the forage quality is really high, it can meet the needs of most animals. However, it's hard to find forage that's high enough to meet the needs of stored forage that can meet the needs of like ewes or does carrying twins or triplets. Usually they benefit by a little supplemental energy. Do they absolutely need it? Maybe not, but it has to be very high quality forage. Just not that common to find.
Okay, another question is, what is your opinion on the feeding of corn gluten feeds?
So corn gluten feeds, again, it depends on their price. They can be a good byproduct feed. They can substitute for some concentrate. I'm not as excited about them as a primary forage, as a sole solution, because they're kind of, if you already are feeding some corn in your diet, you're feeding corn gluten feed on top, you don't have a very diverse diet. You tend to be limited in some of the quality of protein in the diet. But it can serve a certain degree of substitution. Not as excited about it as maybe a more. You would want to limit how much you use.
Okay. All right. If I have hay that's higher in copper, what are some ways that can tie up that copper so that it's safer for sheep to consume?
Okay, so I think I heard you all right.
I can repeat it, Richard.
You said if it's high copper hay.
If I have hay that is high in copper,
Yep.
what are some ways that can tie up that copper so that it's safe for sheep to consume?
Okay.
It's kind of a tough question.
Yeah. I guess it's hard for me to give a blanket answer to that. How high is the copper? Copper has to be pretty high before it becomes a grave concern. One could consider, but you'd have to be careful how you do this, and I hesitate to say it, but you could provide a mineral supplement with a little bit more molybdenum in it as a potential counteracting measure. But I would definitely consult, if you are concerned about that, with like a person, with a good experience in mineral nutrition before you do that. Because if you start adding molybdenum to the diet, it's going to be as dangerous as copper, because they're both toxic substances. What the advantage of molybdenum, what it does is it essentially is it competes. It's sort of an antagonist for copper. So, but I'd be surprised if you would really need to do that. And I guess I'm not. I would watch. The main sources of copper poisoning we see in sheep or feed mill errors and just feeding minerals not meant for sheep, it isn't real common that we see high forage copper lead to true copper toxicity issues. So I'd be a little bit wondering how big of a risk you actually have. Unless it's an unusual circumstance. There are some exceptions, like you could have unique ground that maybe was strip mining ground or just something about it had unusual copper levels. We have problems in Michigan. We have a lot of orchards, and they put a lot of copper pesticides and fungicides on apples, for example. Sheep graze that land, they get high copper levels, but that's pretty unusual.
Yeah, it's hard to answer that without really knowing the actual parts per million.
Yeah, you need a feed report. Yeah, good answer.
This question's kind of interesting. Would there be any benefit to soaking feed before feeding to the herd? Does it help with nutrient absorption?
I got a little echo. The very first thing you said, I got the second part.
Would there be any benefit to soaking feed before feeding to the herd? Does it help with nutrient absorption?
Soaking the feed.
Yeah.
Yeah, in water.
Yeah, that's what I assume, Richard.
Yeah, that's interesting. Boy, that's interesting consideration. I don't think it would do a whole lot. It might help. It might help starch absorption if it was wetted like that. But usually that's not a limiting factor for most sheep. They can kind of chew the corn well enough. For other, like for cattle, like high moisture corn generally is more of the corn gets digested in the rumen instead of the lower track when it's wet like that, because starch is more available to the rumen bugs. But I don't think it would make a huge difference in sheep and goats. That's my best answer.
Okay. Okay. When feeding sorghum, Sudan grass haylage. Did you get that? When feeding sorghum, Sudan grass haylage, what else should be fed along with it to meet needs?
Well, sorghum Sudan silage, it depends on the quality of it, right? Again, I've made sorghum Sudan silage, and if you harvest it and you've got a nutrient analysis that says it's, high energy, high digestibility, you might not need to add too much. But if it's harvested at a more mature stage, it's pretty fibrous. And so it's kind of hard for me to answer that. It's really the same as really any other forage. I'd have to look at its analysis. But as far as concentrates that match with sorghum Sudan, pretty much any of them would. Corn, soybeans, any of those feeds I talked about. So it's a little hard for me to answer that unless I know the quality. Because the species of grass or whatever isn't really what determines the quality. It's the maturity of that species, the relative maturity of it, right?
Okay. Okay. Do you feed soy hulls loose or pelleted? Do they work well in TMR without adding water? Did you get that?
Okay, let me try muting your speaker.
You want me to repeat?
Yeah, I'm just trying to fix my.
Yeah, this is a really good question, actually.
Okay, can you repeat it? I'm sorry.
Sure, that's fine. Do you feed soy hulls loose or pelleted? Do they work well in TMR without adding water?
Okay, so question was, with soy hulls, loose or pelleted, can you feed them dry to and put them in a TMR dry? Certainly. Depends what kind of TMR it is, but I don't see any need to add water, except the pelleted ones would be fine. Dry soy hull feed is kind of powdery. Maybe you'd need to add a little water to get it mixed. But if you're putting it with silage, I don't really think that you would need to do that because it's a wet feed already. But it might make sense if it's a dry TMR to wet it a little bit to reduce the dust factor, if that's what you're getting at. I'm not sure what kind of TMR we're talking about here. Pelleted soy hulls aren't nearly as dusty, right? Because they're pelleted. But soy hulls without pelleting can get pretty dusty. They might benefit from some dust control, which water can certainly do.
Okay. The next question is, in cold weather, we understand that hay equals warmth. Will substitute fiber like soy hulls keep the animals as warm as necessary to keep from freezing?
Okay, so the question is, I guess the soy hulls kind of have the same heat increment of feeding as forages, and is there any kind of temperature issues? Like, I would say no. Assume that you have reasonable fiber in your diet. You got some fiber in your diet. They should have a nice heat of fermentation, nice, I think that would not be an issue. So the kind of diets I was showing here shouldn't have any issues with, heat production. There should be plenty of heat of fermentation.
Okay.
But we feed them up here and it's pretty cold.
Yeah, colder than us, normally. Any nutritional info on distiller's grains? Can it be used similar to soy hulls?
Oh, well, it's a pretty different kind of feed. And you can certainly put some distillers in diets and they can substitute for some poor quality hay. There is a fat content of distillers you have to recognize. So you can't just go hog wild and feed it a lot. The exact amount you can include in your diet, it's a little hard for me to get off the top of my head. You can't substitute at the same rate you can soy hulls, certainly, because distillers is a total different animal. It's got a lot more sugar in it, a lot more fat. And so there's a limit to how much you can put in. But it can be a good complement to another non-forage fiber source like soy hulls. So, in fact, a lot of people use distillers and soy hulls as primary ingredients of even lamb finishing rations and have pretty good success.
Well, I think that's the last question we got. They really asked you a lot of questions, Richard, which usually means they're interested. So,
Good.
I want to thank you very much for a very informative presentation on a very timely topic. And that's going to conclude our webinar for this time. We thank all the viewers. Again, please fill out the surveys. We really appreciate that. And thank you very much for participating. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.